Hi, I'm Dave Chaplin from IR35 Shield and Contractor Calculator. I'm here today with Andy Chamberlain from IPSE. Hi, Andy.
Hi, Dave. Yeah, so I'm the Director of Policy at IPSE. I've been working with IPSE for about 10 years, a bit more than that now. So I've been involving myself in the murky world of IR35 for all that time.
So today we just thought we'd catch up and, well, I guess we will be wiping our tears after not winning the vote last month. Well, actually, it was this month, start of this month, and the legislation went to royal assent on the 22nd of July. So we'll just talk a bit about that, and then it's a case of, right, what do we do next? What was your thinking actually when we lost the vote in the finance bill?
The truth is, it was a tall order, right, to overturn that, because the government has a huge majority. So we needed all of the opposition parties to support it. And going into that, we weren't sure what the Labour Party were doing. And I was trying to reach out to the Labour Party, and I wasn't getting a lot in return. I wasn't getting any great signs of what they were going to do. As it turned out, we did get all of the opposition parties, and we got a few rebels, but we needed something like 40 rebels, which is a lot in a new parliament with so many new MPs, all with their own ambitions. We had about 11 rebels who are sort of the old guard, the usuals, John Redwood, David Davis, people who, have their strong opinions and beliefs and will vote on conscience rather than because they have political ambitions, because they know they're not getting into the government anytime soon, whatever they do. And then, of course, we also found out, you probably want to discuss this, that there was a letter from, who was it? Was it Christopher?
Christopher Blunt, wasn't it?
Christopher Blunt, yeah, Christopher Blunt, who wrote a letter to a constituent, this was all over Twitter. I'm not leaking anything.
Yeah.
Saying that he was going to vote in support of the amendment. The amendment, by the way, was to delay this. That was the key one, to delay the imposition of the private sector rules for another 2 years. But the Prime Minister actually personally intervened and asked him to support the government. At which point he thought, well, I better support the government. So
yes, it was surprising to see that the Prime Minister had to personally intervene. That was certainly news to us. As you say, in the morning, Labour were not on board, but they came through, particularly on the rights issue, with the whole zero rights employment thing. And David Davis did reach across the aisle to Labour on that. The other things we've seen in terms of the letters that have come back from constituents, there seems to have been some robust conversations between ministers and Treasury officials, whereby assurances have been made to try and not hamper the flexible workforce as much, because there's obviously the concern all about blanket assessments and so on, and work going abroad, and firms being fearful of hiring contractors. So assurances have been made. I don't know if you've had it. Did you have that email from HMRC about them introducing and refining their educational packages for firms? Have you seen that one from Owen? I think it was.
Yeah, and I've spoken to some HMRC officials recently around that. I don't know too many more details about this, but yes, but they are now now that this is, because of course at the time we're recording this now, the finance bill it's had royal assent, so this is now there's no stopping this in the sort of legislative process. So they're now very much thinking about how are we going to get everyone who's been against this to be somewhat supportive of it. They really want now groups like IPSE, and probably you too, I'm sure, Dave, say, oh, well, HMRC are doing the right thing here, and yes, we were against this, but fair play, they are doing this and that and the other. And I think that that's what they're now busying themselves trying to do. And this educational support piece is about doing exactly that, trying to help clients to deal with this.
Yeah, so I would say, from my perspective, that this is just a pure PR play on their part. I don't think anything in particular will change. I think they're gung-ho on trying to put everyone on payroll, as many people as possible. And I don't think the insurances made to ministers will come to fruition in any way, shape or form.
Yeah, because they said to me, these officials that I spoke to, they said, what could we do that would basically, give you, IPSE, the ammunition to sort of say that we're doing a good job or say something positive about the way that we're doing this? And I said, well, the problem is that the suspicion is that you want everyone on the payroll, and that when you're going and doing your client education, you're effectively trying to get them to put as many people onto the payroll as possible. And what would be helpful is if you could demonstrate that, in fact, sometimes you're not doing that. Sometimes you're going and you're saying, no, actually, you've got this contractor here or this population of contractors here, and IR35 doesn't apply over there, we don't think. So, you should just carry on and pay them gross. But will we ever see evidence of that? That would be what they would have to do to give us cause to actually to point out, actually, they're doing the right thing here. Because IR35 does not apply to everyone. It doesn't apply. It probably doesn't apply to a great many people for which it will be applied to erroneously after April. And if HMRC was seen to be the arbitrators of, hang on a minute, we know this is complicated, but we think you've got this one wrong. Those guys are outside of IR35. Get them off your payroll. Get them off any payroll. Start paying them gross. Then we would say, fantastic. They're doing the right thing there. They're actually helping clients to work this out. But are they going to do that? That's where, that's what they'd have to do, though, I think, for us to truly say, well done, HMRC.
I'll join with you on that and say that if they do that, I will publicly say so and champion the cause of HMRC. But so far, I've not seen any evidence that would happen. We did submit an FOI, I believe, to HMRC a while ago, or it might have been some evidence in the Public Accounts Committee when we were really going into all of the detail, and they revealed that as part of their investigations and inquiry process, that they did not look at any of the cases where people were found inside and tried to tell clients that they were outside instead. They only looked at the ones that were outside. So this isn't going to happen. They don't have the resources. They're going to be too busy chasing people who claimed coronavirus money when they shouldn't have done. They just don't have the resources to do that, and I don't think they care. But we shall see. We shall see.
I think that, you're right. And I don't think it's even being particularly cynical. I think it's just being realistic. I mean, if you think HMRC are going to go around saying, oh, hang on a minute, you've all paid a bit too much tax or you've paid it in the wrong way, they're not going to do that. They're going to be, when it comes to enforcement of this, so thinking a year or two down the line, when presumably they're going to go into big hirers, they'll probably go and pay GSK a visit, won't they? They've always had it a bit in for them. And they'll say, okay, right, let's do an IR35 audit. Let's look at all your contractors you've had over the last couple of years. Who did you say was inside? Who did you say was outside? Oh, you've put this 1,000 inside. Congratulations, well done. Let's look at the ones you said were outside. Let's have a good look at those. That's how it's going to go. I mean, that's just obviously is how it's going to go. And that's the problem. And therein lies the problem with all this.
Yeah, and it's interesting actually that you talk about how the investigations and inquiries might go, because obviously these agencies will hold the tax risk. Bizarrely, provided that the client has exercised reasonable care, even if they've got the decision wrong, somehow the agency will have to pick up the bill. I still find that bizarre.
It's wrong. It's
just completely wrong. It shouldn't be that way. And I think there are ways where clients can perhaps and agencies can work together to say, okay, if we got it wrong, and then it's our fault. But whether clients will indemnify agencies if they then did get the decision wrong is another matter. I think HMRC will start at the client end as under a normal inquiry process. And this is where I think they are actually going to struggle, because they want to try and group everybody together, which would be technically be called binding all of these people together to say they're all probably inside when they should be outside. But every single contractor has a unique fact pattern. A fact pattern is all of the evidence and everything gathered during that happens during the events of that particular contract. It's all of the facts, and each one of those will be unique and an individual. So they won't be able to necessarily group them together. So the folly actually of clients that decide to do role-based assessments or weak assessments, and everyone has sort of the same profile, they don't do any ongoing compliance, they're actually opening themselves up to more risk. So if anything, you want to be overly compliant, more belt and braces, so that each individual contractor has almost like its own I don't know, like DNA pattern or something, whereby their profile is entirely unique. So then if HMRC do investigate, well, they can investigate one contractor, and when they investigated one, they then have to do another one. So that's how you would, that's the proper belts and braces way, really, to prove that your contractors are outside.
Yeah, I agree. I think, where I might just differ from you slightly on the whole role-based sort of blanket assessments argument that's been going on. So just to sort of recap, there's an argument that goes on around blanket assessments. This is where a hirer, a bank or whatever, might say, every contractor that works here is now caught by IR35. That is a blanket assessment. That is wrong. They haven't taken reasonable care. They shouldn't do that. There's then this idea of a role-based blanket assessment, where you might say, look, and the example often used in the public sector was around nurses, where a NHS trust might say, we've got 200 nurses. They're all on the same contract. They're all basically doing the same thing. And so they're either all inside IR35 or they're not. I have more sympathy for that. I think there are potentially roles where you could say that is a role which is either caught or not caught. But if you're dealing with the kind of contractors that tend to be within the IPSE membership, which are project managers, software developers, they all do different things. There's a difference in how they work. There's a difference in what they're doing. They're never all going to be the same. And I think that you're going to find it much harder to ever find an example where it is a sensible approach to say we're going to do a role-based assessment on these 10 contractors because, for example, they're all working on the same project. Well, so what? They're working on the same project. They're all doing different things, all working in different ways. There will be differences there. They may well be on different contracts, written contracts as well. So I think that's where I would agree with you on the role.
I mean, I guess it depends which side you're coming from there, because if a company has decided, yes, all of these people in this particular role, they really should be on payroll, and if we did assess them, they'd probably all be inside, then they don't have to keep doing those assessments. They could just make the commercial decision, these ones we're only going to put on payroll. They don't have to then start using the excuse and telling agencies these people must be on payroll because they're inside IR35, because as soon as they mention IR35, they have brought into play the legislation, and therefore they have to provide an assessment, and the contractor can then combat that assessment and say why it's wrong, and they have to deal with IR35, or I should say off payroll, because it's a separate piece of legislation. But if they just say this is a PAYE payroll only position, that's probably the better approach for them. They only really need to talk.
What the banks did, didn't they? I mean, unfortunately, we've seen some sort of examples of that where, particularly in the financial services sector, in the lead up to April just gone, April 2020, when we thought these rules were coming in, but the coronavirus plus a bit of campaigning from the likes of you and I maybe kind of stopped that, and the House of Lords committee stopped that from happening then. The banks did decide, they did what we call blanket banning of contracts, which is a slightly different thing to a blanket assessment. You're basically just saying we're not going to work with contractors anymore, is essentially what you're saying. If you want to work here, you're going to have to be on a payroll, and that way we don't have to bother with this ghastly IR35 stuff, because these clients, they are terrified. They're not terrified, but they just think this IR35 stuff is a nightmare. If you haven't had to look at this before, and then you look at it and you realize you've got 1,000 contractors and you realize what's involved, you just think, oh my God, that's horrific. And that's why that's part of the reason why we saw so many turn their backs on contractors altogether, which is very worrying and very, very sad. My hope is, the optimist in me says that over time they will come back. The banks will realise that they need contractors, and to get the good ones, that they have to put them outside of IR35, and that actually when they get their heads around this legislation a bit more, which does take time, you and I have been doing this for years, it's when it does take time, you realize actually if we put this in place and that in place, and we're not trying to get around anything, we're just making sure that this engagement does not fall within the off-payroll rules, then we'll be all right, and we can feel pretty secure, relatively secure, that we're in a strong position to fend off any challenge from HMRC.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, companies are aware of the concept of employment status. They have been for years, but they've never had to really deal with it because they've just simply banned hiring sole traders. If you're a sole trader, there's no way you're going to be able to sell your services to a bank. They always insist on you operating via a limited company. Whereas if you're working for a small firm, then they're a bit more relaxed about that type of thing. But large firms, they want this very arm's length, risk-free ability to hire and fire at will without any of the complications. And that's a good thing that they can do that. And that's now being lost. And that cannot be a good thing for the flexible workforce. So they're going to need to try and get that back. If I was them, I probably would have done what they have done. If you've got 5,000 contractors, some of which that are part of the furniture and have been there for years, you don't know where they all are. You're just going to clear everybody out and start again. So, yeah, I think with the banks, I would have done what they would have done. If you have 5,000 contractors, you probably just need to clear the whole lot out and start again. That is the simple way to do it, rather than trying to assess all 5,000. I mean, it's doable, but then what do you do with someone who's been there for 5 years plus, say, and are you then going to give them comprehensive documentation that tells them, actually, we think you're really like an employee? Well, they would just take that evidence straight to an employment tribunal, and they could try and claim rights. I think they would have a very difficult
it is quite
very difficult challenge to try and claim rights, but because of being via a limited, very complicated, and you're via a limited company, but you still have to defend it. That's the problem.
Yeah, you do. We've have experience of this. We actually tried to do this with a member of our, Susan Winchester. You can look it up. Google it, say Susan Winchester. She was working in the public sector for HMRC. This was the bit that we couldn't resist. Her client was HMRC, and she straddled that April 2017 date. So beforehand, she was working away, thinking this is fine, I'm outside of IR35. She'd had her contract reviewed, all the rest of it. Moves over April 2017, and HMRC say, now you're caught. She came to us and said, what can we do? I want to challenge this. We went to see a barrister and a lawyer, and we couldn't challenge the actual decision. There was no legal way, according to the lawyers, that we could say they've got this wrong. So what we did is we put in a claim for holiday pay and took it through the tribunal. And in the end, on the steps of the trial, on the very day that it was supposed to be heard, after months and months of leading up to it and a case management hearing beforehand, we settled. We didn't want to, but they were saying that they were basically offering her everything that she was asking for, the full payment of holiday pay. And they said that if we didn't take that, we were being unreasonable, and that would have given them license to claim costs. And they had a lot of costs because there was a lot of parties in the chain. So it was an experiment to see where we could go with that. We never quite got to the end of it.
Yeah, if you're in the middle of a case with somebody and you're threatened to take them to court, and they offer to give you absolutely everything, you can't say, "Oh no, can we still go to court?" Exactly. It doesn't work like that.
That's the problem.
But it means you don't then get your ruling by a judge, which is disappointing.
And unfortunately, Susan's accumulated holiday pay was not enough money to put them off. It was about 4,500 from memory. It might have been 4,200. So, they were thinking, well, we'll just pay that. There's a couple of agencies involved, a couple of umbrella companies, and the end client HMRC. Between them, they were all just happy just to dip their hands in their pockets and just pay it, make the whole thing go away. So it was a very difficult position for us to continue to pursue that.
So is there also therefore an argument that if the client says, "Oh, actually, we think you're inside," and this is for the transitional contractors as we go over April 2021, if they're told they're inside, they've been there a long time. Is the argument, well, in that case, then I'm covered by the agency workers regulations? Were you going down that route to then claim holiday pay? Was that how it worked?
Yeah. So partly, so part of the thinking was that we wanted to do something to challenge this idea, and the fact that with the Susan Winchester case, the client was HMRC, it was an extra sort of added bonus that we could take them. The department that was responsible for this rules and test them, put them to the test of their own rule change. The other part of it is that this idea that we've always gone on about, that, is it right that an end client, what this legislation change requires now is for end clients to have a proper look at their engagements with contractors and potentially come to the conclusion, actually, this is like an employment, and we want to treat you like an employee. We want to control how you do the work that you do. We don't want you to be able to send a substitute in willy-nilly. We think that you should also perhaps have an ongoing requirement to do the work that we give you to do. And in that case, should they not? Is the question not, why aren't you employing them then? We're trying to make that point. Now, legally, it's incredibly difficult, as you alluded to. If I'm working via my own limited company, right, and that company has a contract with the client, then my company is the one that's responsible for all my employment rights. If I'm going to take something to court for holiday pay, it really should be my company. But what the IR35 rules is kind of saying is, oh, well, actually, we're going to forget about your company. Push that. We've decided, we've had a look, we've pushed that to the side and said that that's actually a bit of a sham. And so what we have is a relationship between a client and a worker, but we're not going to have to employ you, even though we're saying you're acting like an employee. The point that we're trying to sort of say is that should be the real question. If that's what we're saying should happen, then they should employ them. And yes, they should then go on to that client's payroll, and not some umbrella company's payroll, by the way, but that client's payroll, and they should get employment rights. Or maybe, Mr. Client, what you're actually saying is you want a contractor, in which case, fine, it's outside of IR35. Really, that's the sort of point we've been trying to make with that case, and with another one that we haven't really talked about, but we did have another one on the go for a while as well. So we've been exploring these avenues legally, almost to sort of make the point that this is incredibly complicated, and that this IR35 change in the rules has unintended consequences, and it raises these questions about employment status that the government don't want to sort of deal with, but we're trying to say, no, you have to deal with it.
They have referred to these again, actually, and in their response to the Lord's report, because a lot of the concerns in there are about zero rights employment and this bizarre caveat that it opens up. And they've tried to defend that, well, that's actually okay because we're going to be looking at this and we're going to have a consultation on this and so on and so on. Well, there have been consultations about this for probably the last 10 years, and nothing ever comes from it. So it is what it is.
That's right. So there was the Taylor review, wasn't there?
Yeah.
The Matthew Taylor review of modern working practices, which came out something like 3 years ago now. I can't quite remember. It's something like that. And that recommended, amongst other things, that tax and employment status should be more closely aligned, and that we should have a bit of a thorough look at the whole way that we assess employment status. The government then had an employment status consultation, which was a very lengthy, quite complicated consultation, which, unlike most government consultations, didn't actually have any concrete proposals within it. It simply asked a number of quite vague questions, like, is mutuality of obligation really a sort of a good idea for us to test employment status against that or not? It was all very open-ended. So, and then nothing. And then, to be fair, since then we've had, the referendum, and we've had 2 elections. We've now got COVID, the whole Brexit thing. So there's been a lot of things getting in the way. But yes, I agree. And what we were trying to say to them before the IR35 changes, it's wonderful that you're going to look at this and sort this out. Do that first. Let's sort out employment status, and then you can apply this IR35 thing. Once clients and everyone else knows when is it self-employment and when is it not, when is it an employment, when is it something else, Once we all understand those parameters, then we can do the IR35 change. But at the moment, we're still in the position where we can't agree what mutuality of obligation means, and we have so many arguments over when is that? What is that? Is that a deemed employment or not?
It's we're still in. We still have all of those messes. There will be more consultations. I saw. I think it was last week that they are going to launch another consultation into how the tax system needs to be overhauled over the next decade. And you think, oh, not another consultation, and everyone comes out with their opinions about how to untangle the spaghetti, and rip all the plasters off the plasters, off the plasters, off the plasters. And we're still going to have all these same problems. There'll be lots of discussion, but I can't see anything changing. It's very difficult to do. Going back to your point about the whole, you're either an employee or you're a contractor. Funnily enough, when I was having conversations with David Davis as we were leading up to the amendments and so on in Parliament, he wanted to understand what our position was. And I was saying, well, he's got this whole problem with the rights. They're saying you're an employee like this, but then you don't get the rights and so on and so on. I explained the whole thing and he went, oh, right. So what you're saying is a firm should either hire an employee or a contractor. I went, well, yeah, that's basically it. He totally gets it. But we don't have that now. We have this bizarre situation where a firm who is going to treat someone like an employee, I guess since they're judged as an employee, they could appraise them. They could be in charge of their pastoral care. But then they're going to be a temp through an agency that then goes through an umbrella company that then claims it's their employer that doesn't actually appraise them or manage them or know anything about their day-to-day work. That doesn't seem to make sense at all.
Exactly. I mean, this is exactly what we've been saying. We actually did suggest there's been a few consultations leading up to this, so I get a bit confused about when we started saying this, but for quite some time, we said, first of all, don't do this. This is all a bad idea. But if you're going to do it, what you should do is, if the client decides that IR35 applies, the contractor should go on their payroll. Take the rest of the supply chain out of it. Just put them straight onto the client's payroll. One, because it gives the client more skin in the game, and two, because I think it would shine a real light then on this zero rights problem. Because at the moment, what happens now is a client can simply say IR35 applies, pass that message down the supply chain, and wipe my hands with it. I don't want to know.
It's not fair.
Problem. I don't even want to know. I mean, now because of the liability transfer, I have to make sure that tax is being deducted somewhere. So I can't just leave it up to some nefarious thing. But that may happen. Who knows? Basically, as long as I just feel satisfied that that tax is being deducted, I've got now no responsibilities beyond those that I had before. And what I'm saying is, no, client, if you're saying that you want an employee, you're saying this person is acting like an employee at your behest. You could decide not that they don't. But if you want to control the work they do, then you should have some responsibility for looking after that person. At the moment, you're getting away with it.
I think that's what's going on. And my worry is, and I do have a prediction about what's going to happen here over the next few years, is that we now have the ability for a firm to say, okay, these ones are all inside IR35, even though they haven't really assessed them properly. They tell the agency, they say it's payroll only, but then the agency says, this one's inside IR35, so therefore you must use an umbrella. Well, there's two problems with that. First of all, the agency has no legal right to enforce an umbrella on anybody or any type of payroll scheme. And if it is inside IR35, then they should have had an assessment and then the person should be able to combat that. So what the agency needs to be saying is this is just a PAYE only role. And then my other concern there is that when you bring an umbrella into the situation, that the terms in some of these umbrella contracts, they can differ. I mean, I'm talking about the traditional umbrella. They can differ, and it means that if something like the coronavirus happens again, then as we have seen, it really did shine a light on all the different types of clauses and contracts the contractors had. Some of them were given, were furloughed properly. Some of them couldn't because of the contracts. The whole thing was a complete mess. So there's no such thing as one size fits all when it comes to umbrella. Another concern that I have is that there is still the messaging in the market that says, IR35 is the same. Nothing has changed except who does the decision. Well, that's not true. And you and I have done many seminars on this when everyone who's presented that day has said employers NI is now on top of the rate, whereas under the old rules, you used to take it out of the rate. It was a deduction. So the old types of umbrellas align with the old type of IR35, but they don't align with the new type of IR35, off-payroll, Chapter 10 of the legislation. And you end up with, if it's not presented properly, you end up with unlawful deductions of secondary class 1 NICs. And that creates a mess for everybody. So the government have introduced these key information documents, which should make things a bit better, but there's still confusion. So we now have different types of umbrellas. There's one called PEO, which is Professional Employment Organization, where whatever rate you're quoted, that's what you get paid. And these are, well, it just looks like payroll processing really, but you still become the employer. And then there's another one called joint employment. Again, it looks similar to just standard PAYE. So there's no this reversing out of employment costs and all this sort of stuff. It's just if the rate advertised is £25 an hour, that's what you get paid. So there's lots of variations, and it's very confusing for all of the parties, and it's easy for parties not to understand what's going on and things to be done incorrectly. Now, if you recall, when we were all sat around the table with Jesse Norman, we were all saying, regulate umbrella companies before you put this in. Absolutely do that to stop all of the dodgy payroll schemes. They say they're an umbrella, like a proper one, but then they're not, and you have loans, and this mess is still going on. And I do wonder, based on the fact that a new consultation came out, I think it was the week before last, about how to tackle these tax avoidance schemes. I wonder if they have already decided in advance that they're going to get rid of all of these payment intermediaries. And that would then put things back to the agency having to deduct the tax and pay net. Because if they're not passing the money to anybody else, no one else can step in the chain and start introducing schemes. So I think
the industry, a lot of agencies would struggle with that. So I mean, I know that some agencies are set up to do that fine. You know, the big ones that you've all heard of do have payroll and do pay people via payroll all the time. There's quite a few niche little agencies out there. I mean, when I talk to IPSE members, it's very seldom do I ever hear the same agency mentioned twice. They seem to be there seems to be a huge array of agencies out there. And my understanding is a lot of them are quite small. They don't operate a payroll model. They never have done. They use contractors, and they have a supply chain. They pay gross. They receive money gross. They pay gross to the contractor.
Yeah.
This can come in. This is why we've seen this proliferation of umbrella companies, because those agencies have never been able to, or they've never been willing to put people onto their own payroll. And so you have these umbrella companies. One thing I would say is some umbrella companies are completely legitimate, or at least
of course,
many of them are. There are some big names out there that if you've heard of it, it's a big name. They're trying to do things correctly.
Yeah, absolutely.
But it is a wild west as well, and there are all sorts of funny little umbrella companies that crop up here and there, and they've got these weird and wonderful schemes, and they say, "Come to us, and you'll be able to take home X number of your pay." And this is what happened with the loan charge. This is how we got to where we are now with the loan charge and all the problems that that's caused. And this IR35 change has opened the door back up to these cowboys to come into this market and start mopping people up. It's part of IPSE's job to try and get the message out there. Be very careful. You know, if you're being offered big take-home rates, I would be very, very cautious. Have a good look at what's going on there, because you could land up in trouble. I am pleased that the government did launch that consultation last week on clamping down on the purveyors or the promoters of these schemes. It remains to be seen whether that will be enough. Whatever comes out of that, let's see. But certainly that's something that IPSE has been calling for a very long time. We've been able to operate basically free from seemingly hardly any investigation or pressure from HMRC at all. They're out there saying, we've got this scheme, it's fine, do this, sign up to it, it's perfectly legal. And as soon as, you know, HMRC come knocking at the door of the contractors, they're gone, they've vanished.
It's a game of whack-a-mole for HMRC.
Yeah,
these just pop up all over the place, which is why I think maybe there's an argument to say, don't even give them access to the money. So make the agencies run their own payroll. But as you say, I mean, I think it's 68% of all agencies are small businesses. So they don't want to do this. They don't have the things in place to do it. So whilst they could outsource it and sort of bring someone in as a bureau service, that itself has quite a bit of cost. And of course, they won't then necessarily gain from the economies of scale that the umbrellas do. I mean, the umbrellas are very good at what they do, the big ones. They're very heavily automated. They run on very, very thin margins. Huge
turnover and a small margin. But a small margin is massive. It's like billions. Exactly.
Maybe there's a way to do it. There will be legislative hurdles to overcome, but somehow they need to stop these the dodgy ones getting themselves into the supply chain.
Well, that I think this is partly what the transfer liability rules, which don't really affect contractors, so we don't go on about it too much. But this is new. This is another point where what you're saying is true, that this thing coming in is new. It's not the same as before. So now there's going to be transfer of liability. So if HMRC say, hang on a minute, where's all the employment taxes from this IR35 court engagement? They'll go to whoever is the fee payer, which might be an umbrella. But if they can't get it from the fee payer because your fee payer has disappeared and gone off, then they will go back up to agency one, and then which is the top agency, and even then on to the end client. Which it's HMRC are trying to say to these big hirers and big agencies, you must take responsibility for your supply chains and make sure it's conducted. But I still think it's going to be messy.
Well, this whole transfer of debt legislation, well, it's new that accompanies Chapter 10. There's transfer of debt legislation with the MSC legislation, but none of this has ever been tested in court. We don't know how easy it is for HMRC on a legal basis to just say, hey, you're going to go and pay someone else's tax bill now. I mean, they can't make it that easy for tax risks to just transfer around everywhere. So, I mean, it's yet to be seen how easy that it will be for them to do. It's possibly more of a stick and a bit scaremongery, but it will be difficult for them to do that.
Well, I've always said that I don't like that provision, but I haven't really ever banged on about it because the contractors don't come into that argument. It's all happening above them in the supply chain. So it's not something that I've particularly worried about. But I have always thought and said when it's come up that I don't like that, because I think that if a business does everything within its power to be compliant with any rule, whatever it is, it shouldn't be held responsible because someone else has done the wrong thing. There should be something that you can do to just discharge your responsibility. To say, I've ticked every box. I've been good and compliant. This is, I can't be held liable for this. Those rules actually pour cold water on that. I think that's wrong. You're right. It may not be quite so easy to enforce.
There is actually a very, very easy way for the agency to carry no tax risk under the new Chapter 10 legislation. And the correct reading of the legislation is that if the client has done an assessment and it's inside IR35, they are obliged to pass that down the chain. And the reason they're obliged to pass it down the chain is so that it can be challenged. That's the whole point of it. That's designed to produce that behavior. Then the reason there's transfer of risk of debt is that when that does pass down the chain, if someone decides to say, we're going to ignore that one that says inside IR35 and I'm going to override that, then that person can then be made responsible for that extra tax. The other people have actually met their responsibilities. So that's the behavioral effect that it's designed to do. Now, if it's outside IR35, there is actually no legal obligation on the client to pass that SDS, the status determination statement, to the agency. And it's only when they pass it to the agency does the tax risk then travel. So they could say to the agency, this one is outside IR35, please process accordingly, but just don't pass them the status assessment. And then the client's made their own decision. They've decided it's outside IR35. They're taking all the risk and they've not passed it to the agency. Now, that I think is how the legislation was designed to work. Then we have to sort of go, well, that's theory. Let's have a look at the practice. Agencies typically, one of their selling attributes when they speak to clients is, when you hire through us, you don't have any risks at all. And they sign clauses with clients to indemnify them of any tax issues and so on. It may well be that in this particular instance, they could say, except when you've made a decision that it's outside IR35, but whether the client would accept that, I don't know. Maybe that's just a commercial arrangement that needs to be made. But so there's a way around it. It's not even a way around it. It's sort of the correct intent.
I've heard
I don't know what will happen.
Yeah, I've heard agencies say that in the initial days when all this was, I think, probably in the private sector, when this policy was being formulated. You know, I have to say the agency representative groups have also lobbied very hard against this change as well. That they have been dead against it. They can see that for them this is a whole world of hassle and pain that they don't need. And they did say when they worked out, they said, so actually the best thing would be if a client just somehow forgot to do an SDS. Because then we don't have any. That's actually, but of course you're absolutely right. They know that in practice, those agencies will say to the clients, I think you need to give us an SDS here. What's going on with that? Because they feel like that's part of their job, is to make sure that the client is being compliant with everything they need to do as part of the engagement that they're getting a commercial benefit from. So yes, it would be in their interest to say nothing if a client perhaps was ignoring it and was not fully aware of what their responsibilities were. But I think in most cases, responsible agencies would actually say, you do know, client, that you're supposed to be doing this.
Yeah, so, absolutely. I think in reality, in many cases, it will pass down and the agency will want to see it so that it's just helping them out with compliance. Which then brings us on to, well, what if the agency doesn't agree with it? So what if the client has in place a very weak assessment regime? Let's say, for example, they were using a tool that might have been provided by, shall I try not to say the word? But let's say it used a very weak tool like CEST that doesn't really, that tells everyone you're inside. And if you are outside, then it's either because it's an over-reliance on substitution or it's completely ignored all of the questions. You can't rely on that. What we're actually finding at Shield, and so apologies for the plug, but we're finding with agencies, they want to redo the assessments if clients are using things like CEST or they've got some Mickey Mouse assessment that isn't really robust enough, because they know that they're holding the tax risk. So they want something a bit more robust. Do we want to talk about CEST? Do you have anything to say about it?
Yeah. So CEST, of course, is just in case anyone doesn't know, it stands for Check Employment Status for Tax. It is an online tool which was developed by HMRC. It's asked a series of questions, and probably the main thing for you to know about it is, first of all, it is not mandatory. It is a voluntary tool. You can go on and look at it. You can put information into it. You can play around with it. It doesn't report anything back to HMRC. You don't have to put your name into it or anything like that. But it will ask you questions such as, if you're going to be the client, it will say, are you the client? And you say yes. And then it words each question depending on what you've said. So you could be the client, the agency, or the contractor. And it will ask you questions like, do you, the client, have a right to reject a substitute? And if you say, yes, I do have a right to reject a substitute, then that will point the tool in a direction which will end up with an inside IR35 determination.
Outside. If you do have a right to substitute, it will always say you're outside.
Sorry, maybe let's get my wording correctly. If you're the client and you say, I have a right to reject a substitute, then the engagement is likely to be caught.
It will be more likely because the hurdles you then have to get over in the control section are very, very high. And they're so high, they're almost unlikely to ever happen for most contractors. They just set the bar ridiculously high. You know, if outside is here, they set the bar right up here that no one's ever going to get over. And if they do get over that one, they'll say, well, you must have answered that incorrectly, so therefore we're not going to stand by the result. It's essentially, it's a bear trap.
I agree. And the reason why I mentioned that particular substitution question is because I've played around with that tool quite a bit, not as much as I think you have, Dave. And if the client was to answer that question in the wrong way, as we would see it, in other words, you know, that they would say, no, I won't just allow the contractor to send a substitute whenever they want to. I would, but in fact, what they're saying is I would have a right to reject that substitute. They're not saying, no, I wouldn't accept it. They're just saying, I reserve the right to reject the substitute. If they say that, and I think that most clients will say that, because you could come in with a raving lunatic and say, here's the substitute. The client's going to want to be able to say, no, I'm not having that person. If they say that, then you have to work extremely hard answering the rest of the questions in that tool to end up with an outside of IR35 determination. And that's not the way the case law works.
That's right.
In real life, you may not have a right to send a substitute, but that doesn't mean IR35 applies.
Absolutely.
The case law is very clear. There are various other factors, and we're probably going to get onto one of them, which is the most contentious in a minute, which could point you. They all have to be aligned to say that this is an employment, or this is to be considered an employment for tax purposes. And just failing on one of them is not enough. But in that tool, it pretty much is. In that tool, if you get that question wrong, then I don't think you're going to get an outside of IR35 determination.
No,
and I think that's one of the many flaws with the CES tool.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I totally agree with that. To clarify what needs to happen for a valid substitution, the law is laid down in paragraph 84 of the Court of Appeal ruling for Pimlico plumbers, and there are 5 different types of substitution. Essentially, the contract, if you do have a genuine right, it should say that the client can only reject a substitute if they do not have the necessary skills. So you might have words like you're allowed to provide a substitute which the client is not allowed to unreasonably reject, provided the person has the necessary skills and qualifications. There's different ways of wording it, but essentially it needs to be linked to that condition of if they have the equivalent skills, then they cannot be rejected. So that means they can obviously reject people that are raving lunatics. But you wouldn't actually need something if you sent a raving lunatic in, then they would probably breach the contract anyway, because they wouldn't be providing the skills and they wouldn't be able to complete the schedule of services that you have in the back of the contract anyway. So it'd just be a breach of contract. So they don't necessarily need to go that far. But yeah, the substitution clause, they need to be worded correctly. You see them incorrectly worded all the time.
No, you're absolutely right. But that question, which I keep coming back to, and I often raise this in my webinars, I actually put the screen print of the question from the tool. It doesn't say that. It uses very particular and odd wording that I think if you were a client, you would hardly ever click, no. The answer is, do you have a right to reject a substitute? And then it says, rejecting a substitute. It says something about the qualifications, but it's not very clear. I can't remember it off the top of my head. And I just feel like 99 point something % of clients answering that question are going to click no. And once you click no, you end up with it's caught by IR35, or if you work very hard, you'll get it can't determine. But I've never managed to do it to get it's outside of IR35, and that is one of the problems with the CES tool.
Well, it's interesting you say that, because what we have there is sort of, I guess, misleading or leading wording that might encourage them to answer it in a certain way. What we find when we are doing assessments for clients, what we find when we're doing assessments for clients is that, for starters, 2/3 of our assessment is answered by either the client's lawyer or whoever they're using, or the project manager who are doing the working conditions. And we often find that the project manager who's answering the working conditions, if they try to answer the ones that are based on the legal side of things, then they will answer those questions based on what their expectation is, not necessarily what the contractual obligations are between the parties, because the project manager's never read the contract. So it's very important when you're doing these assessments to get the right people to answer the right questions, which is why we have this thing called collaborative assessments. So each person who's responsible for answering the right bits of it answers those, because otherwise, without that, as with any assessment, however it's done, you will suffer from a garbage in, garbage out. And an expectation of someone is entirely different to a contractual obligation. A contractual obligation will hold more weight when it comes down to the rules of evidence in court, and it is an express term, and it's more difficult to override based on a fact find. So understanding how these cases are run and how the evidence is weighted and so on in court is absolutely essential for when you go all the way back to who you're going to ask the questions of and what does it actually say in the contract. And if we go back, I'm going off on one a bit here, but if we go back, say 15, if we go back about 15 years when some of the cases were being run through the HMRC, were trying, about 1,000 cases, weren't they, back in 2002, I think, something like then. That's when we had general commissioners and special commissioners. It was done much more on working practices rather than the actual contracts. But fast forward to now, I mean, defending these cases is a completely different ball game. Lawyers are always involved. Barristers are involved at HMRC, almost all cases now. Armies of lawyers with the barristers, and everything goes down to the case law, and that's the starting position, the contracts and the case law. And then there's an overlay of the fact finding on top. So it's much harder, and it's just a different game now than it used to be. I mean, if you go back 15 years, we hadn't had the auto cleanse ruling, and the auto cleanse ruling enables the fact find and the facts of what's happening on the ground to perhaps override terms within the contracts or have those terms set aside for not being realistic or worldly wise. We never had that 15 years ago. People would just shove the substitution clauses in and happy days. But you can't do that anymore. It just doesn't work.
All that was before my time, and certainly auto cleanse. Was that something like 2012? Was it auto cleanse? It was round about then.
I think you might be right. I don't know why I've got 2008 in my brain, but it might be 2012.
I'm pretty sure it was because it was since I was looking at all this sort of world, and I started looking at this world in 2010, and but I've always thought that it's very important that you have this. The way I've always thought of it and tend to advise people is that if you have a bad written contract, in other words, you have a contract full of holes and clauses which point to employment and therefore IR35, then HMRC will use it against you. But if you have a watertight contract that's really strong, they'll say, well, that's all well and good, but let's look at the working practices. It basically helps you to you pass test one. Now, having a good written contract isn't going to absolve you from IR35 risk, but it does get you over the first hurdle, and therefore it is important to have a good contract.
It's absolutely essential to have the contracts properly drafted. And that's something we help all of our clients with. We check all of the contracts. So we're asked to look at all of their template contracts and that they use, the agencies or the client uses, and to make sure those are reflective of what's happening in reality. Because when it comes to a defence, the contract is the starting point. I've just looked up auto cleanse. We're both wrong, 2011. Supreme Court was 2011, so maybe the Court of Appeal was 2010. I mean, interestingly, staying on the auto cleanse topic, last week the Supreme Court were listening to the Uber case.
Yes, very interesting. Yes,
and auto cleanse is going to play a major part in that, and it will be interesting to see whether or not that has a positive effect or a negative effect on defending IR35 cases going forward.
Yeah.
I don't have a view on that at the moment. Just waiting to see when it comes
I
out.
I really wanted to watch some of those proceedings, and I didn't get a chance to see any of it. And I don't really know sort of what the arguments were. I know what they have. I've followed this case right the way through from the first employment tribunal. Of course, Uber have lost at each stage. It is Uber who have appealed at each stage. So the Supreme Court is now being asked to overturn each of the other rulings, which have all found in favour of the drivers. And this is an employment status case. So this is those drivers saying we are not self-employed, we are workers. But it's going to look at all this stuff that we look at for an IR35 assessment, substitution, mutuality of obligation, which I think is really interesting in an Uber case, because I think there's a strong argument to say there is no mutuality of obligation. But I'm not going to argue with a Supreme Court decision, because whatever they say, I think it will have an impact. And so it's a very, very interesting case. The sort of short history of Uber in the UK and indeed around the world is quite interesting if you follow it. And I've made it my business to follow it a little bit. So I'm very, and I think I spoke to someone at Uber a couple of weeks ago. They said that they thought the judgment would be around September. So we'll see.
Oh, okay, yeah. We'll have to look out for that. Shall we talk a little bit about mutuality of obligation? It's the contentious debate in case law at the moment as to whether we'll call it that for short, whether or not it's different in tax law to employment law, whether the obligation should just be simply paying someone for doing work, or whether it has to mean more than that, some sort of guarantee or minimum of work. Does the guarantees have to go in both directions? It's a contentious one.
Yeah, it's highly contentious, and sort of at the heart of the current disagreement is the fact that HMRC have set out their position, and I think that their position is at one extreme end of a spectrum of opinions about what mutuality of obligation really means. So I think that to the side of HMRC's position, you have a range, and most people sit somewhere in that range, but they're right out there at one side. And what HMRC say is that if there is a contract, there are mutual obligations set out within that contract. At the very minimum, they are, you do some work and we'll pay you. And they say that means there's mutual obligations. They say that's it. And therefore, you don't have to even ask the question, is there mutual obligations? Because there obviously is, because you have an agreement. Now, that's their position. There is another position, and there is case law which backs up this sort of position. The example we often use is Usetech versus Young, where the judgment there said, look, you can't just, and I have to paraphrase this because I don't have it in front of me, but it sort of says, look, you can't just say, as soon as there's someone has an obligation to work and the other one to pay them, or to pay for work done, you can't just say that on its own indicates that this is an employment. It could very well be a freelance engagement. That's paraphrasing the words, but that's essentially what that case law says. And so this other idea around mutuality is that there needs to be an ongoing promise that work will be offered, and an ongoing promise that work will be done. So the contractor is sort of saying, I'll keep on working for you. I'm not just going to agree to do this one bit of work and then that's it, and possibly we'll have another chat after that and we'll agree the next bit of work. I will keep working for you for as long as you want me to work for you, and you will keep offering me work as long as I want to do it. That's what I think mutuality of obligation is more like, and that's quite different from what HMRC is saying.
Yes, I would agree with that. I would just add one more nuance to that, whereby an employment where there is strong mutuality of obligation is where somebody makes themselves available for work, and they have said, I guarantee to make myself available for work for 40 hours a week. And the deal there is you'll pay me just for turning up, whether you give me any work or not. And an employer is actually obliged to give someone work, but they're also obliged to pay them if they've made themselves available and not given them any work. Well, that's not how a contractor works. They only get paid for the work being done. And then this sort of bleeds into the control area of what as well, and can be picked up in the termination clauses in a contract, because if you're only being paid for work done, there's really no need for there to be a termination clause of a month, because they could just tell you you're not turning up, so I'm not going to pay you to do anything. So there's lots of factors that you can look at in a contract that enable you to see, is there some sort of mutual guarantee that's happened here between two people to say, I'll turn up with my box of skills, you keep giving me things to do, and this is where the control what comes in, and I'll agree in advance that whatever you give me to do, I'll use my skills to do them. That is more of an employment, because if it doesn't have to go that far, then isn't everyone who does casual labour pretty much caught under this type of legislation? If there's nothing extra, we're all sort of stuffed, aren't we?
Well, that's exactly what this judgment in Uset versus Young sort of said. Is it said, like, you can't just say, well, everyone's, as soon as there's any sort of mutual obligations on the parties, you do a bit of work, I'll pay you for the work that you've done. That you can't just say that's employment. That could very well be a freelance operation, couldn't it? I could say to someone, will you fix my shed? We agree what will be done. I'll say I'll pay you if you do that. It's not. I'm not employing them.
No.
So this is. But HMRC have set out this position, which basically says that is the case, and this is where they've run into lots of trouble in the courts recently, and also in with their CES tool. It's probably worth mentioning that the CES tool does not test for mutuality of obligation. There are no questions in it which are designed to understand whether mutuality of obligation applies to that engagement. And HMRC justify that decision, that they don't test for that in the CES tool, because they say, well, there's always mutuality of obligation in a contract.
Yeah.
And so this position that they have adopted really ties into the whole way that they want the off-payroll rules to be applied by end clients, basically. And this is being challenged in the courts currently, and there is one case which is going to go to the Court of Appeal.
Yeah, that's the professional referees case.
Yeah.
So the upper tribunal case clarified the law. It didn't make any new law, and it looked back at mutuality of obligation over like the last century. So there's that one. We've got the result of the Kickstarter case, which is actually came out this morning, but by the time this recording goes live, we probably would have written about it. So that might provide a bit more for us. Maybe the Supreme Court with the Uber case might provide something more on this, but
I do wonder. I wonder, because I think, you see, that there is no ongoing obligation to either do or provide work in an Uber contract. So I think that it could. However, previous courts have not picked up on that. But I think that is certainly an interesting area for mutuality of obligation as well. That whole Uber case, and this referees case, as you say. Here is a case which does centre a lot around mutuality of obligation. And HMRC took the referees to tribunal, first tier tribunal. HMRC lost on MOO. Upper tribunal, HMRC lost. At that stage, HMRC, I believe, should have gone back to the drawing board with their opinion and say, look, the courts are disagreeing with us here, and maybe we should actually look at the CES tool as well. But they haven't done. They've appealed it. So we're going to get a Court of Appeal case. I think that's going to be heard next year. I don't know what you've heard about that. So
I'm not sure on dates on that one.
Well, I spoke to someone at HMRC yesterday. They were sort of mumbled something about next year. So I don't know. I couldn't pin them down. But
so this debate is just going to keep going on and on. But once the decisions have been made in the courts, that should be the law from then on in. It's HMRC can't take the position, well, we don't like the decision that's been made, so we're going to appeal that. And while it's being appealed, we just carry on with our old-fashioned. It's only being, every single contract has enough mutuality of obligation. So they're a bit behind the law on this, but we will be getting more clarification on this before next April, which can well, it could go either way, couldn't it, really? I mean, I'll be surprised if suddenly there's brand new law that says we're not the slightest bit interested in mutuality of obligation and it applies in every single case.
Yeah, you'd be overturning, half a century of case law, basically, going back to the seminal case of 68, ready-mix concrete and all that. We should just mention, actually, just in case people, aren't aware, IR35 status is decided on a range of factors, but the three big ones are substitution, which we've talked about, and we believe, both Dave and I believe, that there is an overemphasis on that in the CES tool, and the way that question is worded leads people to answering it a certain way. Mutuality of obligation is the other one, and control, which you referred to earlier, Dave, which is all about who controls how the work is done, probably most important, what work is being done, even where and when work is done as well, all come into this idea of if you're a contractor, you should have a good degree of autonomy in the work that you do. Whereas if you're an employee, according to the case law, there's a master-servant relationship, which basically means your employer is going to tell you what to do and when to do it, and quite possibly where to do it as well, and probably how to do it. If they don't like how you're doing it, they'll say, no, don't do it like that, do it like this. That's an employment. As a contractor, it should be a bit more like you're going to say, okay, well, I'll get that done, should have it for you by next week, and there it is, you've done it. And they do get to maybe say, we don't like it, do it again, but they don't get you to tell you how to do your work because you're operating independently.
No, I mean, we made those arguments. In fact, I spent quite some time and had a moment of revelation at about 2 o'clock in the morning before we did our submissions in the route case the next day. And I tied the whole thing in with control and mutuality of obligation by saying that the difference is in the sequence of events. And this is what we submitted in our submissions and the judge agreed. Under an employment, you don't really know what you're doing until you turn up. You've just agreed, I will do work for you a certain amount of hours. You've sold your skills and time. And they have said, all right, and we'll give you work to do. And you may have had a rough discussion of what it's going to be, but you don't really know. Whereas a contractor who's outside IR35 has had a discussion with the client. What is the work you're looking to be done? What do you want me to work on? There may have been some rough spec of what it is you're going to do. And then you turn up to do that work. And if they ask you to do something else outside of the scope of what was originally agreed, then obviously you'll be saying no. So they don't have control over that. So it's about the sequence of events and who has control over what's going to be done and when that was decided. And hopefully when the route case goes to upper tribunal, that the tribunal will agree again that we got that right. Maybe that will make new law. I don't know. We don't know when that's going to tribunal. We don't have a date yet. I mean, I would imagine it's at least a year away because they're all stacking up in the upper tribunal at the moment. HMRC seems to be taking everything to upper, whether it loses, and just throwing its toys out the pram.
I think that all of this does highlight, doesn't it, that this problem with the way IR35 works, which is it has ever been thus, is that given what we're talking about and all the things we've talked about and all the different interpretations of this case law and how it's so hard to know any certainty which is the right way to go, how does anyone ever know whether IR35 applies to an engagement or not? And the suspicion has always been, from HMRC's point of view, that confusion has over the last few years led to people being non-compliant. In other words, they just go, oh, I don't know, probably it's okay, I'll try and get away with it. That's what HMRC think. What they're doing now by moving this responsibility to think about all this stuff onto the end client is they are banking on the fact that the client is going to go the other way. And they are going to say, oh, this is really confusing, but I don't want to get in trouble with HMRC, so I'm going to put everyone inside. And they're now going to turn that confusion, which has worked against them, perhaps, arguably, over the last few years, and work it in their favour. And what groups like us have been saying all this time is, let's have a bit of certainty. Let's just know whether IR35 applies or not. And therefore, let's get in place something which people can understand so they know whether they're paying the right tax. Most businesses just want to pay the right tax, but they're not going to pay more than they have to. And if there's some really confusing rules there, there's enough people saying you're probably all right and outside of this, they're not going to pay that tax. Doesn't make them bad people.
No.
It's just that they're just doing the right thing, and they're saying, on balance, I think this is the right thing. I'm gonna do what the advice is.
I think I mean, in our tool, we put employment status on this 19-point spectrum between, you know, you're strongly outside and strongly inside. And where we have these ones that are close to the middle, we would say to the clients, well, make your decision. Do you want someone that's like an employee, or is this work that you want to do like a contractor? And if you want to do it like a contractor, then this is how you need to hire someone, and this is what your contract needs to be like. But you can't do all of that and dress up someone who is really just being hired like an employee. There's no point. You're going into sham mode. So just don't sit on the fence. Just make your decision. Are you doing project-based work? Or you want to hire a proper contractor? They come in, they do their thing, and off they go. Or do you want someone that you want to boss about every day that just turns up with their box of skills for 40 hours a week? Just decide what you want to do. And if you want an employee, hire one. Put someone on a, I don't know, fixed-term contract or something. Forget about all this other stuff. Just get what you need, and that's the least risky thing to do, is just fixed-term contract. Just do it.
I agree, and this comes back to, right as we were talking about right at the beginning of this conversation, does come back to this idea of what do you want? Do you want a contractor? In which case, put in place a few things. Once you understand it all, it's not too difficult. Get a good contract. Make sure your working practices line up to that, and set that out in writing. And you've got then a pretty rock solid argument. If HMRC ever came knocking, you're saying it's not IR35 court. The contractor's saying that. The agency's saying that, and you've got paperwork which backs that up. There's nowhere for HMRC to go in that case. They're not going to be able to say that IR35 applies. But if you don't want that, if you think IR35 does apply, employ them. What you're saying is you want an employee, or at least, as you say, fixed term contract or something, because that's not a contractual arrangement that you're dealing with there. So do something else. Find another avenue, a way to engage this person. I agree. And as I say, my hope is that over time, we will see more of that thinking coming into clients, and they will actually understand, right, we can hire contractors. We just have to do this, this, and this, and everything's fine. Everyone else, we're going to put onto fixed term contract over here. That's the optimistic me.
I mean, I take that optimistic view, I think, just based on the law and an understanding of actually how easy it is to hire someone as a contractor and be protected and make sure everything's in place from the offset. There are complications after that. So I just think people need to make the decisions of what they want to do and operate accordingly, and just get rid of all of this fuzzy area in the middle and proceed. And I guess, you know, crystal ball time, I think we'll probably see what we've got April 2021. We'll probably have turmoil until the end of next year, perhaps. And then 2022, we'll start to see clients hiring a lot more on an outside basis, and things will just settle down.
I agree. I hope that's right. And I think that might be right. I mean, I wasn't around at the beginning of the initial IR35 that, you know, talked about in the 99 budget, came into force in the year 2000. And there was, I understand, huge amounts of upheaval and turmoil then, because a lot of contractors thought this was it. This was the end of their way of working. Unfortunately, many unfortunate souls ended up being pushed into these nefarious umbrellas, getting caught up in the loan scheme. There was all sorts of unintended consequences from it. But actually, over time, what happened is contractors learned that, well, one, join IPSE or PCG as we were back then, and two, just make sure you've got a few things in place. Get a good contract, get that contract reviewed. Make sure your client understands the arrangement, and actually you can feel pretty secure that IR35 doesn't apply. And I hope that the same thing will happen now with the clients who are now going to have this burden to think about.
One of going into sort of preparation mode now, I mean, that's something the contractors need to do, is to educate themselves. I mean, there's still many contractors that don't understand they just don't understand the details of IR35. And in the interest of doing a blatant plug right now, my book, IR35 Off-Payroll Explained, we're releasing that for free on a digital version next week to everybody. I say next week, but by the time we've done this, it might have gone out. But one of the challenges is the clients need to be educated, because they are getting information coming in from so many different directions from companies. Well, there's no other way of putting it, with a vested interest in them not hiring people on an outside basis. So, or only hiring people on an outside basis. So, for example, if you're a payroll company, you're going to probably scare the client to death and say you need to hire everyone on payroll. And if you're an insurance company, you'll probably go around telling everybody, oh, it's going to be fine. You've got nothing to worry about. We'll do your assessments. Oh, but you must buy this insurance policy. Buy insurance. So clients need to get themselves educated. They need to watch out for, I think, suppliers with vested interests, and they are going to need to take on people that really understand this legislation inside out, because I don't know what you've seen, but there are lots of pop-up IR35 experts appearing out of nowhere that just seem to have one page of bullet points and suddenly think they can charge people £500 a day for sorting out IR35, but it's just not going to work.
Yeah, no, that's true. There's been, lots of little organisations come out the woodwork because they sense that there's an opportunity to make money here with this change, and they probably will make some money, some of those people, but that doesn't mean they'll be giving out good advice. I mean, we're going to make for free to our members some resources available. What our main message is to contractors: if you're in an engagement now and you think that engagement is going to go on beyond April, talk to your client now, or maybe after. They want to have a summer holiday, but pretty soon you want to get in front of them and you want to say, look, you're probably going to be aware that the off-payroll rules are coming in April, and you're going to have this liability. Now, I know quite a lot about IR35 because I've been a contractor for the last X number of years, and I've had the contract reviewed for this contract, and I am satisfied that IR35 does not apply to this contract. And therefore, we should have a chat about what we can put in place to ensure that we feel comfortable about that together. Now, this is the dream world, of course. Sometimes it's not that easy, and your client's going to shut the door on you or say, I don't know anything about this, talk to so-and-so, talk to Jeff in accounts. Jeff will say, go and talk to HR. You'll be given the runaround. But if you can identify someone who's ultimately going to have to sort of do this IR35 compliance work for your client, then I would recommend you get in front of them as soon as possible and start telling them why IR35 doesn't apply to this engagement. And say we're going to start trying to make some tools available, maybe a template letter that you could write to your client as an approach on this. So keep checking our website in the autumn, because we do want to give people the best chance they can of actually getting out in front of this. I think if you do nothing about this, unless you suspect your client is so head in the clouds they're not aware they've got this liability at all, but most of the big ones will be aware of it. If you do nothing, there's quite a high chance you're just going to get a letter through the post saying, "Oh, we've decided IR35 applies."
Yeah, absolutely.
But are you going to get anywhere with that challenge? I think seize the initiative. I would say, and get in front of them and talk to them.
And of course, if you are with a client and you're currently operating on an outside IR35 basis now because you've decided yourself that you're outside IR35, if they then say to you, we think you're inside IR35, it's probably not a great idea to stay at that client and accept your fate, because that could affect your historic tax risk. What you've got there is a client who's not on your side at all. Should HMRC investigate, they have the powers to get copies of the assessments that were done inside, and they will just issue an opinion. And it's then your job, however unfair that opinion is, to then prove that that was wrong. Well, is that client you're working with actually going to provide you with any evidence that goes against what they've just told you? Well, of course they're not. So you're totally stuffed. So I think
it's a good point, Dave. I mean, just to reiterate that, although from next April, the liability is going to sit with the fee payer, probably going to be an agency or an umbrella company, whoever's paying you, they're going to have the liability. If that tax isn't deducted, HMRC will go after them, not you as a contractor.
Yeah.
for the previous 6 years, up to 6 years, you remain liable for all the engagements that you've had. And the HMRC have said things like, well, we're not so interested in looking back retrospectively once we get into this new regime. But that's not quite the way it happened in the public sector, and they made similar sort of promises then. So you do still need to be cautious about the contracts that you've had and the contract that you have now. And you have the IR35 liability right now, and you want to make sure that you're on top of that. And get some tax investigation insurance and keep that in place, because you're still liable for the next 6 years.
Absolutely. I mean, I think to be realistic about it, HMRC have made the promise that if the person starts paying taxes as if they're inside IR35, then they won't look at historic years. That there's no legitimate basis in law to rely upon that guidance or what HMRC have said. If you owe tax for those previous years, you owe that tax. The other thing would be, I guess, an argument against that you'll probably be okay. And of course, two parties can have a difference of opinion. Your client may well be wrong that they're saying you're inside IR35, but you still got the risk. There's also the fact that they haven't really done any investigations, or hardly any investigations, for what, the last 10 years? It was only when, was it 2012 or 2014, when Margaret Hodge started raising the issue again at Public Accounts Committee? I can't remember when it was.
Yeah, it was about then, wasn't it?
Yeah, so
2013, we had, it led to this sort of examination of what was going on at the BBC. And
absolutely, yeah. So that was the kickstart of it all again. HMRC by that time, and we'll have to look up the date, had pretty much given up on IR35 because they could never win any cases and they cost too much to run and so on. But then they got hit over the head by the Public Accounts Committee, so they started again. And of course, it can take 4 or 5 years before one gets to tribunal. But other than that, there's hardly anything been going on. There was an FOI I saw the other day where HMRC conceded that they have 65 cases that they're currently looking at that might proceed to tribunal. Well, that's just a drop in the ocean compared to the number of contractors out there. So the chances of actually being investigated by HMRC for historic stuff, when really they might want to focus their efforts on future stuff, is very slim. Let's not say it isn't, but that is not any reason whatsoever to not make sure you've got your ducks in a row. Because if you are investigated, then, and you're one of the unlucky ones, the way they run these investigations, I would say, is in a manner whereby they always present the facts that are on their side and not yours. And it's very difficult to shut these cases down now before going to tribunal. They're happy to go all the way. And the cost of defending that, a really good defense, 50,000, something like that, more if you're then going to upper. So you'll need a, what's that?
So join IPSE, because
you need about 100k of cover.
We will help you at first point of contact, anything that HMRC say, and that's exactly what we do, and we've helped loads of members. I mean, the other thing I would say is you're absolutely right. There's been hardly any, and if you look at the history of IR35 cases, what number are we on now? 30-ish or something, 30, over 20 years?
I think 38, something like that. Yeah.
So, but they've had a lot of other investigations which they close before they get to tribunal. They just bully people into paying them, basically. And people who don't have the support that comes with an IPSE membership or some other support may find themselves quite easily bullied into pay. People get scared and they think, oh, I better just pay this tax. Can't work out this IR35 stuff. So, yeah, but you're right, Dave. They were busy in the noughties. Then there was a case that I went to, Primary Paths. With the tribunal in something like 2012. That was basically the last one for years. And then we've had the recent spate, particularly TV presenters. Started off in like 2018, didn't it? Krista Atwood was one of the first ones, and she lost. And then we've had a series of other ones since then. Yeah,
all those presenter cases are sort of backed up over the ones that are going through the courts and going to upper. But it's mainly presenter cases. I don't know, other than that IT case that we won, well, you've had Northern Lights, but there's really just not many. Otherwise, I would have heard about them.
Northern Light is being appealed as well, actually.
Yeah, that's going to upper.
Yeah, supporting that appeal. So we'll see how that one gets on.
So we don't know what's going to happen from April 2021 for the next 6 years. And we talk about 6 years because HMRC, and quite rightly so, can go back 4 years if they discover that you did something wrong, and they have a good reason to believe that you got your tax wrong. And if they think that you have been careless, then they can go back another 2 years and extend that to 6 years. So if you basically stuck your head in the sand and did nothing, you've been careless. They will definitely argue that. They try to argue it in lots of cases, but it's quite a high bar to get over. I don't want to go into lots about reasonable care, but it's because it's extremely subjective. But provided you had an assessment, I think it's going to be difficult for them to even argue that you were careless. I mean, even if it was a rubbish assessment, you could still argue, depending upon what was in your mind at the time, that you adhered to reasonable care, which is an odd thing to say, but that's what the law is. So I think for most people, provided they're protected for 4 years, that would sort of make sense. We don't know what will happen. Maybe they just let the clock tick for 3 years and then suddenly attack 100,000 contractors who have all suddenly gone on payroll. We just don't know. It's difficult for them to do, because look at the loan charge. They were going after 50,000 people, and they said, well, we can't possibly open 50,000 cases. So they just invented a new law that went back retrospectively. I don't know whether they could do that with IR35. I'm not sure what the argument would be, but
if they tried anything like that, I don't think they could do that. No, I can't see how they could do that. But I think the main thing is that you are it's just that reinforce that message that, you know, when April comes, you are still liable for the previous 6 years.
Yeah.
That's what people should just be aware of. So, you know, you can still land yourself in real hot water there.
Great, thanks, Andy. It's been great to talk to you today. We've certainly covered lots of ground for IR35. I think the key message there for everybody is that they need to prepare and they need to educate their clients.
Yeah, seize the initiative. Talk to your client before they talk to you. Let them know that you understand IR35 and that you want to help them with their IR35 compliance, and IPSE will be there to help you too.